Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. In my case, that is freezing cold Copenhagen, Denmark, where it feels like it's January, even though we're in the dead of April. In Dan Runde's case, I think that's Washington, D.C. I see Dan, that CSIS backdrop in the background. And I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this event to talk about Dan's terrific new book. It's called The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power. Dan is the Schreier Chair in Global Analysis at our neighboring think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. More importantly, he's had a long career in government and in the private sector, but particularly around one of the most important tools of soft power, which of course is international development. He was a senior official at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. He played a major role in forging the BUILD Act, which retooled the way the United States does global project finance. It retooled the role of OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and other agencies of the US government that do project finance. And he's a deep thinker and a doer, as well as a thinker about the tools of development, but also, as the title of your book, Dan, implies, the tools of American soft power. You know, by the way, I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. And Dan, I'm really glad we have the chance to do this. You know, Dan, the thing we hear most often in Washington these days is we're in this era of strategic competition among the major powers. People who know my work know that about 80% of my time is spent in and around Asia. So particularly on China, which US-China, it's ground zero of global competition between big powers in a lot of ways. But so many people talk about that challenge as if it's a strictly military challenge. It's just a challenge of deterrence in the South China Sea, deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And it really, I think, I've thought for a while, misunderstands the kind of power China is, but also the multifaceted range of tools that a country like China is using around the world to extend its influence and build its profile and have a larger posture. China's a trader, but it's also a builder, it's a lender, it's an investor, and increasingly it's using tools of what we might call soft power as well. So that's probably a good place to start this. Is to ask you to talk a little bit about why you wrote the book, but also the top line themes. But as you do that, I'm hoping you can dig in a little bit, because it's in your subtitle, on what you mean by soft power, whether you mean just what Joe Nye at Harvard meant when he talked about soft power 15, 20 years ago. And just frame this up for us a little bit conceptually before we start to dig in on the tools of development, about what you mean and why you think it's important that we think about this.
Evan, I'm really grateful to you and Carnegie for hosting me. This is really appreciated. I've been a friend and a colleague for a long time. I wrote this book because I do think we're in an age of great power competition. I've had some people ask me if we're in a second Cold War. Maybe we could come back to that. But I eschew that term. I've been kind of dodging that term because I think that's a pretty loaded or freighted term. But if we use the term great power competition, I still think I think the stakes are really high. I think that what I would say is that most of this great power competition is going to be non-military. It's going to be non-military. And so I think just as you were saying earlier, that most of this great power competition, or almost all of it, is going to play out not in Russia and not in China. It's going to play out in largely what might be described as developing countries or the global South. It's going to play out in the Pacific Island states. It's going to play out in Africa. It's going to play out in Southeast Asia. It's going to play out in Latin America, Central Asia, places like Ukraine and Moldova. So we need to have a set of responses to a series of non-military challenges that China and its sidekick Russia present itself with. And I need a little bit of a hall pass from your listeners. So if I say China, I mean the Chinese Communist Party, not all Chinese people. And if I say Russia, I'm talking about Vladimir Putin's murderous regime that's illegally invaded Ukraine and is committing war crimes. I'm not talking necessarily about the Russian people. So I know some people, when they say, oh, Dan, when you say Russia, you mean everybody in China, everybody in Russia. And when you say China, you mean everybody in China. I think for this conversation, I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. So I think we need a non-military strategy for all these challenges. I have a story that I think kind of illustrates kind of the point. But that's the main point of the book, is that this is great power competition plays out in the global South. Most of it's non-military. We need a non-military strategy to respond. We cannot fight something with nothing. So I have a story of, if you want, that'll kind of illustrate what I'm trying to get at.
Sure.
Okay, so we all remember COVID. I got Pfizer, I got Moderna. When Pfizer, Moderna came out, there was only so much Pfizer, Moderna to go around. So developed countries like the United States that either paid a premium or have been involved in kind of the development of Pfizer, Moderna got first dibs on it. We told developing countries, take a number, we'll get to you. And it may be 6 months, it may be 9 months, which is not a great answer for them. So in a number of countries, I'm going to use some examples. So the Dominican Republic was told, take a number. So China went to them and said, we've heard a rumor that you, Dominican Republic, are thinking about re-recognizing Taiwan. You wouldn't do anything like that, would you? No. We've also heard, you've also made statements that you're not going to include the fine firm of Huawei in your telecom system. You wouldn't do that, would you? Oh, no, we would happily include Huawei in our telecom system. So they got plane loads of Sinovac. Now, we can argue about the efficacy or the quality of those vaccines. They were basically crap vaccines. But if you had a choice between crap vaccines and no vaccines, you were going with the crap vaccines. And so there's lots of terms like vaccine diplomacy that's used, but it was a form of leverage in the case of the Dominican Republic. In the case of Guatemala and El Salvador recognized the mainland about 5 years ago. Guatemala recognizes Taiwan. Guatemala and El Salvador share a border. El Salvador got plane loads of Sinovac. Guatemala was told, hey, take a number. The Chinese Communist Party and the government of El Salvador did highly publicized vaccine campaigns on the border with Guatemala, saying, so that the press in Guatemala was saying, if we only recognize the mainland, we too would get Sinovac. So this is a form of influence and power. And the point is that mainland China has the ability today to fill voids that they didn't have the ability to 10 or 15 years ago, whether it's in the digital space or the vaccine space, the multilateral space, infrastructure space. If you look at the trade agenda as well, and you know this, Evan, 20 years ago, the United States was the largest trading partner for about 130 countries in the world. Today, that's flipped. Today, China is the largest trading partner for about 120 countries in the world. That has all sorts of impacts in terms of how interconnected you are with a country, what kind of leverage you have over a country or not. In a lot of places like Latin America or Africa, where they're the number one trading partner, it has all sorts of implications. When I talk about soft power, which is one of the questions you asked, what I mean by that is, I think it's a bucket of a series of different kinds of tools. So I think it's things like foreign assistance, absolutely, including things like health. I also think it's our leadership and minding the store on the multilateral system, and we could talk about that as well, because I think this is now a contested space. I also think it's things like certain forms of infrastructure, especially digital. We do not want the digital rails of the future owned by Huawei, ZTE, and Alipay in the global South. It's going to have all sorts of bad commercial and national security implications for us and for the world. It's also around things like values like democracy and human rights. It's also things like international education and training. But I also think it's about what kind of is it so, people talk about autocracy and democracy as sort of the competing models. That's part of it. I also think there's a public diplomacy or strategic communications component to this. I think, unfortunately, folks like Russia are doing a pretty good job through their Russia Today, propaganda of sowing all sorts of discord and putting forth all sorts of, distortions and lies that are causing all sorts of problems. I also think it can mean things like not necessarily military per se, but let's call it military systems, military training, as well as folks filling in certain kinds of security spaces, things like the Wagner Group or this sort of a thing. It bumps up against that. So I would say that's sort of the far end of it. but I'd say it's minus pure military, minus the intelligence as an asset, as an use of intelligence as an asset. I would say it's any of the non-military spaces. I'm going to call it it's international development, it's diplomacy, it's certain kinds of commercial and public diplomacy, and it's certain forms of what I might call military engagement with folks, as well as long-term training and education. I also think it's things like people-to-people ties as well. So it's all of that. So I think of it as sort of a large bucket of things. In the U.S. system, we have something called the 150 account. There's the 050 account if you're in the defense world. That's the defense budget. We have another budget called the 150 account. This is our development and diplomacy budget. Much of it, not necessarily all of it, is encompassed in the 150 account. But I think that gives a sense of sort of the listeners of what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. So I just to tease where I want to go with this, I really want to dig in on American strategy and American tools, because you've had executive experience working with the tools. You've seen where they're effective and where they're not. And I don't usually like to be too Washington centric, but in this conversation, I really want to talk about how the U.S. is doing. But before we get to that, I want to go back to something you said. You said something about the U.S. creating voids around the world, which is interesting, because if that's the case, then one might extrapolate from that to conclude that it's not really for a large chunk of countries around the world that the offerings from American competitors are necessarily so attractive. It is, as you put it rather bluntly, that you can't beat something with nothing. And so what I've often noticed around the world is that for a lot of countries, the way they talk about this, the mathematical operations that seem to matter are addition and multiplication rather than subtraction and division. There may or may not be a void, but in any case, they're trying to extract as much as they can from as many partners as possible. So in the public health space, yeah, they want Sinovac, but they really want Moderna too. In the education
they would prefer Moderna.
Yeah, sure. They want education and training slots at American universities, but they wouldn't mind a few at Chinese, European, and other universities as well. So can we just talk about kind of structurally what's happening globally? Do you think that the United States is becoming non-competitive around the world in the sense of creating voids because it's stepping back from roles that it may have played during the Cold War when there was greater urgency to this? Or is it just that there's more competition in terms of who's out there offering things in these spaces? In the public health space, the US didn't have competition. In the education space, 15, 20 years ago, nobody wanted to go to a Chinese university. They wanted to come to the US. But I read a paper recently that said that in the Arab world alone, there are something like 14,000 Arab students at the MA and PhD level studying in China in STEM subjects, or at least there were before the pandemic. So that offering wasn't there before. So is it that there's a void and there's kind of American disinterest, or is it just, the sort of rise of the rest and there's just more competition and it gives countries in the global south the opportunity to leverage this potential for a greater multiplicity of partners?
It's a really good question, Evan. I would say there's three things. I think if you push Indonesia or you push, a number of countries would prefer not to pick and would rather kind of optimize among the different powers a little bit to what you're getting at, Evan. Like they take a little bit from us and a little bit from China. I do think at least what they tell us, or like maybe what we want to hear, or what I want to hear is for them to say is, well, we'd really rather go with you, Dan. Maybe that's, maybe this is sort of, there's a little bit of that. Maybe it's baloney, but I think it's actually true. Like for example, in the case of Africa, you have all sorts of Chinese business activity happening in Africa. The Africans will say, why don't you see us the continent as a business opportunity as opposed to some kind of a humanitarian opportunity? They might put it that way. And we'd rather work with you, United States, but if we have nobody else to work with, we're going to work with Africa. That's a little simplistic, but I think you get what I'm saying. Yeah. So I think some of it is there's like, we don't want to pick. There's some of it is they do say, if we have an option, we'd prefer the Cadillac. And in most things, you provide the Cadillac infrastructure, the Cadillac military system, the Cadillac education system, the Cadillac tech solution, in most things, though that may also be changing. Then there is a rise of the rest issue. So I do think, just using the vaccine thing as an example, in 1990, mainland China could not have whipped up an alternate to whatever the West was going to come up with as sort of a response to a pandemic. Today, they've got enough scientists and enough of an industrial base that they can. So I think there is a rise of the rest component to some of this. And so there is more competition. There's also a rise of the rest component to it in terms of international education. 60 years ago, you'd have said you want to send your folks to the US, maybe the UK, maybe France. I'm just for this conversation. Since then, the Canadian educational offer, the Australian educational offer, South Korea, Japan is a really big player. So there was sort of a series of other OECD countries. Then you also started seeing in middle income countries and even lower middle income countries an increased offering of educational alternatives in places like Latin America or even in Africa. I'm on the board of an African university in Ghana that was set up 20 years ago with tech money from the West Coast. It has 1,500 undergraduate students. It's a private university. So you're seeing things like this. But you're also seeing now China doesn't offer a Cadillac education system offering, but they've got Chevys. So they can charge, for their $100, they can educate, instead of one student, they can educate 3 students. So you're seeing a higher level of students. If they have the opportunity to study in mainland China, they'll do it. This was obviously, as you said, this was pre-COVID. So they're becoming we have something like 1 million international students in the United States. There's certainly the number is a 6-figure number in terms of how many global South students were studying in mainland China BC before COVID. And I think a year from now, when kind of this sort of all sorts itself out, finally, I think you'll see those numbers come back. So they're becoming a global education competitor. In my view, international education is a really important form of our influence. We don't think about it in those terms necessarily, but when people come to the United States, they're very aware of our flaws, and we're very aware of our flaws, but we're also not aware of our strengths. They're very aware of our strengths, and we're less aware of our strengths. And they come away especially impressed by our strengths. Some people come away saying, oh, 1 to 5% of the people that come and study here are very focused on our flaws, but 95% go back and have a very positive view of the United States. They have Boston on the speed dial instead of Beijing on the speed dial when they become a CEO, when they become the head of the central bank, when they become the prime minister, when they become the minister of public health. They're calling Boston, not Beijing. So over time, we want folks to be in the US, or I'd prefer in the OECD countries in the West and the Western democracies, including Japan or South Korea, because we want folks to kind of see that as the development pathway as being one of market democracies, not autocratic state-owned enterprise, techno-authoritarianism that China has on offer. So I think, so some of it's right, but I do think there's a fourth point to your question, which is I do think we took a time out both at the end of the Cold War on something saying like, we're the unipolar power. We don't have to kind of work that hard in different things. We're the only game in town in terms of keeping the multilateral system going. We're the only game in town in certain things like foreign assistance. We're the only game in town in terms of infrastructure. We're the only game in town in terms of tech. That's all changed in the last 15 years. And so we now have to return. I also think there was one additional thing, in addition, sort of like the end of history thinking, was I think the financial crisis of 2008 and also the Iraq and Afghanistan wars made people in the U.S. say, I don't really want to engage in the world. I don't necessarily want to cede global leadership, but I'd like to have a time out on global leadership. I'd like to, not have to work that hard at it. The problem is that mainland China has the ability, to your point about the rise of the rest, to fill those voids. So it's a combination of a series of things. And yes, some of it was us ceding space. Some of it was the rising of the rest. And some of it was our folks kind of balancing among offerings.
So do you think this is changing now? How do you assess the state of the discussion in Washington around this? I mean, there's definitely a lot of attention to strategic competition with other major powers, China in particular. But the case you're making, invest in soft power, make the U.S. attractive, don't try to beat something with nothing. It seems so intuitive and logical, and yet the US really seems to be struggling. And I mean, you travel around the world and I hear many of the things that you've said. People say, well, where's the US offering? Where's the US? Why is the US creating these voids? So that why question, I'm curious how you'd answer that. Is it that there's a lack of attention? Is it that the budgets aren't there? Is it, as I implied in the setup, that the US thinks about this more as a military competition and needs to change its conceptual paradigm? There's something interesting in your book. You talk about 3 Ds. So it's defense, diplomacy, development. But you really prioritize development much more than most people do when they talk about those things. Most people I talk to in Washington, they talk about defense. And then some will talk about diplomacy, but you don't hear as much about development. It's kind of the afterthought. So is the problem that people get it, but they don't prioritize? Is it that the money is short? Is that the political consensus isn't there? What's the state of the debate in DC? And where
So I think there's a political consensus. I think one of the positive things, and I know this is going to be a little controversial for this audience, is I think one of the positive legacies of Donald Trump's presidency is that he helped crystallize a new consensus towards the People's Republic of China. And so if you look at sort of I think, you follow this more closely than I do, Evan, but I would argue there's a through line between where the Trump administration was and where the Biden administration is. So I think there's a bipartisan consensus on we have a problem with the People's Republic of China. There's now a full consensus, especially after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. There's a very strong consensus that says we also have a problem with Vladimir Putin's murderous regime. What we don't yet have a consensus on, I think it's going to take several years to work out, is what do we do about this? I think we're still in the process of sorting out what's the bipartisan, we need a bipartisan consensus similar to the early part of the Cold War, or even kind of at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, about what are we going to do about this? And so I think the China Select Committee is a good platform for sort of some of that discussion. I think it was a mistake that the previous Congress would not have a China Select Committee. I think it was an error. I think that this new Congress having a House Select Committee in China was a great thing, led by someone and I know, Chairman Mike Gallagher. It's a very smart guy. They've put really able people both on the Democratic side and the Republican side, really able staff. So I think there's an opportunity to do some of this there, but it's not alone going to be able to do it. So I think there's not a consensus yet on what do we do about the fact we're in this age of great power. Well, I will tell you this. When I say to the most MAGA-hatted person I know, are you cool with ceding global leadership to China? I haven't had anyone in Washington yet say that would be awesome. That's great. They can have it. No one has said to me yet, like, that's awesome. If they have techno-authoritarianism powered by Huawei, awesome. If they become the world's leader in international education, that's awesome. If they become the number one trading partner for most of the 33 countries in the Western Hemisphere, that's awesome. If they control all the mines and minerals and metals processing in the world, that's awesome. If they become the partner of choice on commerce, including things like infrastructure, that's awesome. If they run we kind of seed the space in the multilateral system and they become the CEO of a lot of these institutions, making hiring decisions at the margins, screwing Taiwan, doing stuff like hiring, tech companies associated with the People's Liberation Army to service, for projects in the multilateral system. That's awesome. I haven't had anyone tell me that in Washington. So when push came to shove in the Trump administration, when they were asked, are you prepared? If you do this, you're going to cede space to China. And in essence, an order, a system, is a series of Lego building blocks. And so different pieces of it, some of it's military, but it's things like who minds the store at the multilateral system? What kind of trading system do we have? What kind of values are we espousing? A variety of things kind of are like the Lego building blocks of a global system, a liberal, you and I would call the liberal international order, the small L liberal international order that's been around since World War II. I'm interested in seeing that system go on over the next 100 years. And what I believe is that mainland China and Russia would like to set up an alternative order. And so all these different things that we've talked about, vaccines and digital and trade and the multilateral system and international education, are all Lego building blocks of trying to establish an alternate order to some extent. And so when I've pushed people in Washington, are you prepared to have China set the rules of the road for the world? I haven't had anyone say they're cool with that. But what they haven't said to me is, okay, well, what price are you willing to pay? What burden are you willing to bear to prevent that? We haven't kind of sorted that out yet. So I think part of it is that. I think there's several other things too, Evan. I think most people in Washington who do foreign policy or national security, I had a very prominent and really thoughtful member of Congress who's a Republican who I liked. And she had worked at the World Bank. She had worked at, in international development far earlier in her career. And I said to this person, hey, I want to come talk to you about soft power. And she kind of looked at me funny and said, soft power? I want to talk about hard power. And so I think there's also, among Republicans in particular, there's a sense that the development space, and there's some truth, some of it has, I think, some truth to it, is like it's inhabited by kind of hippies and kind of one worlder types, or that there have been problems with it. And so there are problems with our development system. There's problems. And I think so I think there are folks who don't think it's too fuzzy. They see this stuff as too fuzzy. It's not sexy enough. So don't get me wrong. I'm all for a 500 ship Navy. I'm all for peace through strength. I think we need a very strong military, but I believe having a strong military alone is not going to solve the challenges in front of us. If most of these challenges are going to happen in the global South, if most of this is going to be non-military, we need to rethink our toolkit. And we haven't been prepared to do that yet. And so I think we're in the process of kind of sorting out, like, okay, we have this problem. What are we going to do about it? We haven't yet been willing to do it. And then we have these kind of hangups about the post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, post-2008 financial crisis, sort of like, do we want to do this or not? We have some concerns about, do we really want to, what kind of levels of burden sharing do we want? I think that's the other thing is, I think if you took a very charitable interpretation of some of the things the Trump administration did that seemed really obnoxious and really crazy, what you would interpret them to have said is, okay, what they were really trying to do was to renegotiate the terms of global burden sharing with other burden sharers of the current system. And I would argue that the Biden administration is also in the process of doing some of that as well. They're just, somebody, I think Elliot Cohen said it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration with better manners.
So good. Okay. So, yeah, I think that captures a lot of the discussion in Washington. Can we dig in on some of the tools? So maybe we start with, I kind of want to start with development.
Yeah.
Then get into infrastructure. Then maybe talk about kind of trade in the multilateral system. So on development, I mean, you've worked at USAID.
Yeah.
There's always a fight over the budget. You actually talk in the book a little bit about kind of levels of resourcing over time. How do you think the development tool is optimized for the U.S. now? Do you think the budget's about where it should be? Do you think the priorities are right? Do you think priorities and budgets are matched? Is kind of strategy and resourcing in the right place? And particularly, you might serve in a future Republican administration. So imagine a Republican president-elect. I mean, what you write the transition memo on USAID. What is optimized and what's not? How's the spend look? And what do you think needs to change in the way the U.S. does?
So I think there have been a series of accumulated challenges in our development budget for a long time. We made a series of Faustian bargains at the end of the Cold War, where we said we would work with a variety of interest groups to say, protect the overall budget by making sure that certain folks got certain pieces of the pie. And so as a result, there's very little flexible money in the development budget. So there's in essence there were in essence arrangements that were set up 15, 20, or even 25 years ago about, well, we're going to get, this is our piece of the pie, and this is what it's always going to be. So you have this problem. So you also have, I think, a problem of a series of the world that we're in. I think we're going to have a lot of fragile states and conflict affected states. And the way we've never been that great at working in fragile and conflict affected states. I think we need to do a much better job in terms of personnel and thinking about how we train people and the kinds of commitments people make to kind of very complicated places. There's at least 20 or 30 really pretty difficult places that are sources of terrorism or migration or spawning, all sorts of chaos. And so, but we're going to be for it, whether we want to avoid being involved in these places or not. We're going to continue to have to be involved in these places. I think we ought to rethink how we engage in those places. And in my mind, we would have extended stays where someone became an expert in Sudan and learned to speak the local languages of Sudan and made a 7-year commitment to the country of Sudan. Now, maybe they don't live in Khartoum all 7 years, but let's say they did 4 one-year tours in Khartoum. And when they weren't in Khartoum, they would be in AFRICOM in Germany, or they'd be in Washington as the senior desk officer or some kind of a senior advisor of some kind, just working the Sudan file. Because I think we need much deeper expertise in some of these really complicated places that are, and so I think this has been something folks have suggested. So I think we have a problem with our budgets. We have a problem with our personnel. We also have problems with how, we have something like more than 20 agencies that deliver different forms of assistance. When John F. Kennedy set up the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, there were 4 agencies, and he said that was too many. He had read a book, and you'll remember the title, and many of the listeners may have read the book, is the book The Ugly American, which came out in 1958, and I talk about it in the book. The Ugly American, I would argue, is the most important book in American foreign policy of the second half of the 20th century. John F. Kennedy was so appalled by what he read in The Ugly American, which is a book about sort of our having a tin ear for kind of working in different complex cultural contexts and kind of bumbling through this, whereas the Chinese Communist Party in Southeast Asia was much, had local languages or were doing a much better job in running circles around us. Whether that was true or not doesn't matter. It felt like it was true at the time. John F. Kennedy bought 100 copies of that book and gave one to every member of the U.S. Senate. He was so upset. He also, as a result of that book, started the Peace Corps when he became president. He started the Green Berets. He reformed USIA. He created the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which is sort of like the founding act of kind of all of our foreign aid. He also had a special initiative just for the Western Hemisphere called the Alliance for Progress, which is well remembered in the Western Hemisphere, all because of that book. So I think that we have too many agencies. I also think that we need to decide, like, if we have a consensus, we've got a problem, we can have a consensus about what to do about it. In my mind, there's a handful of things we would do. We would have a special initiative about closing the digital divide so that we prevent mainland China. We need like a PEPFAR for the digital space. We cannot have Huawei and ZTE own the digital rails of the future. We need something like a PEPFAR, if you know PEPFAR, which is the HIV/AIDS initiative.
President
mining, right. So if you're concerned about climate change and you don't get up in the morning and learn to love mining and minerals to the tips of your toes, it's a baloney conversation, Evan. Like, the amount of mining we're going to have to do, decarbonization, if it's going to happen, does not mean dematerialization. So a lot of that's going to happen in the global South, and a lot of that's going to be accelerated or enabled by foreign aid or foreign aid-like activities. But if you tell me, like, I've been in this business a long time, nobody's idea of a good time at the Exim Bank, nobody's ideas of a good time at the DFC, nobody's idea of a good time at the World Bank or the International Financial Corporation, no one's idea of a good time at AID is mining and minerals. If we were serious about it, we would have an initiative at AID that's as big as how much we spend on agriculture and food security. We spend about $1 billion a year in agriculture and food security. We ought to have $1 billion a year initiative on mining, minerals, and strategic, kind of like metals processing. Mainland China controls 40% of all global metals processing. So we're going to switch oil, the oil production of Venezuela, Iran, and Saudi Arabia for the People's Republic of China in minerals? Like, hell no, that's crazy. So we're going to have to think that through. I think there's a special initiative on digital that needs more money. There's a special initiative on mining and metals. If we're serious about the carbon transition, we need to love mining and minerals in a deep way, and we don't. We also need to do something on nearshoring and reshoring. So when they cut off our pills and ventilators during COVID, that was grounds for a divorce. So I don't know if it's a full divorce. Maybe it's more like they get to bring their spouse to diplomatic Thanksgiving and I get to bring my spouse to diplomatic Thanksgiving, and we can have a blended holiday photo together with the People's Republic of China. But we're going to have a different kind of a relationship. And I sure as heck don't want to depend on mainland China for anything as being the one producer of anything. So we need to use ODA, foreign aid, as like a WD-40 lubricant to accelerate people saying, okay, we're going to have a China +1 strategy in Vietnam, or we're going to have a China +1 strategy in the Philippines, or we're going to have a China +1 strategy in Panama. Or we need to like help support kind of that use. There's certain things you would use foreign aid for that. So those are just three things. And then finally, I spent a year sitting in my basement, and so did you during COVID. I'm sick of it. We need to have a much better strategy on early warning systems for pandemics. We have some ability to do this, but we need to do better. But we also need to invest in, going back to my story about Moderna and Pfizer, we need swing capacity in the developing world, in small societies that are, capable, like Uruguay or Singapore or Panama, where we can create swing capacity for vaccines so that they can kind of hit the switch on and start producing a lot of Moderna or a lot of Pfizer, so that we're not caught in the same thing that we were caught in again, 2 years ago when the Chinese were leveraging the fact that we were telling Guatemala, take a number. So those are four things. So there's something on budgets, there's something on personnel, there's something on the org chart, and then there's a series of special initiatives. So would I plus up the foreign aid budget? Yeah, in a targeted way, I would. Would I say we ought to double it? No. But I think there's some targeted things. Are there some things we could probably consider making some trade-offs on? I think so as well. I also think this is not your grandparents' developing world. It's richer, freer, and more capable. There's been enormous amounts of taxes collected in the global South in the last 20 years. Many poor countries are able to finance a lot of their what's called basic human needs. They're able to finance a lot of their basic education. They're able to finance a lot of their basic healthcare, including things like HIV treatments. And so I think we need to have a more adult conversation. PEPFAR has been enormously successful for 20 years, but in a number of countries that could afford to pay for their HIV medicine, they have us over a barrel because they're like, I'm not going to pay for this, you pay for it. And when we say, and they say, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to pull the plug on the HIV medicine? And we say, no, we're not going to do that. So that we're going to have to find a way to get some countries who really ought to do a bit, like, for example, South Africa ought to pay for their meds. Right, they just did a military training exercise with Iran and China and their navies. We're giving the South Africans something like $300 or $400 million a year to pay for their HIV medicine. I don't even think we get much of a thank you now. So I just think we need to think about that. I think so. There's some things we need to think about there.
Yeah, well, soft powers. Do you think the U.S. I'm glad you mentioned PEPFAR. Do you think the U.S. has the capacity for those kinds of initiatives anymore? I mean, we were both in the Bush administration. The president did PEPFAR. PEPFAR's had this huge PEPFAR, for audience members who don't know this. It was the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, which is an enormously successful and very popular in Africa targeted program that's played a major role in combating HIV in Africa. When I think back to that, I mean, that had a few ingredients in it. One was presidential leadership. The president took the bull by the horns, was really interested in the issue, and was personally invested in it. Second was bipartisan consensus. And third was working with countries in Africa to tailor the program to their needs and realities. So I just wonder, is that kind of presidential leadership available to us these days? We're in a hyper-partisan atmosphere. Can we get that kind of consensus on these sorts of initiatives, or are we kind of in a post-PEPFAR? I mean, it's always the one everybody says, oh, look at PEPFAR.
Look at PEPFAR.
Yeah, another PEPFAR. So we keep talking about PEPFAR, but I'm waiting for the post-PEPFAR, and I never see it. And I'm wondering.
So I think PEPFAR, part of the reason. So I think part of the reason PEPFAR happened was there were a number of constituencies that were supportive of it beforehand. But what happened was, I think there was also some analytics done by one of the intelligence agencies that said that there was going to be enormous, drastic disruptions on the continent of Africa with sort of this wave of HIV/AIDS sweeping the continent. There were going to be millions of orphans. There was going to be economic disruption and movements of people and political disruptions as a result of HIV/AIDS. And so I think there was a national security push. All of the major initiatives that we've had since the Marshall Plan have had a national security push behind it, a geopolitical or a geoeconomic interest. We've always been done this from a place of enlightened self-interest. So in the case of, so if the coup in Czechoslovakia was the spark that launched the Marshall Plan, the fear that we were falling behind in against the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party pushed a renewed sense of various initiatives on soft power in the Kennedy administration. So I believe that, unfortunately, fear is a pretty good spur. And I think that we have a healthy concern. Let's put it this way: we have a very healthy concern, or even a lot of concern, about mainland China and their sidekick, Russia. So I believe, I think when you pose it, if we frame the question as, are you prepared to cede having all global metals controlled by the mainland China? And if it's explained the right way to the American people, and we had a president who was willing to spend some political capital on it, W is willing to spend political capital on HIV. I think if we could say, like, do you know that this is part of your lead, as part of stopping and preventing China and Russia from setting up an alternative system and ensuring that the U.S. continues to lead the current system over the next 100 years, we need to do several things that are in the non-military space. I think we can get a bipartisan consensus on this. So I think unfortunately it's going to be fear of China supplanting us that's going to move us in a way. I don't want to overshoot it. I don't want to demonize China. They're not 10 feet tall, but they are a serious, we talk a lot in the military world about near peer competitors. They are a near peer soft power competitor. They can, if we this is not 1995 anymore. It's not 2005 anymore when we were both in the Bush administration. China was hardly on the radar. It's not even 2015 anymore. They are in a very different place. So we have got to up our game. And we have to understand that a lot of our maintaining our leadership in the world is going to be answering the mail in a number of sort of slightly less sexy, but really important things.
So go back to, earlier in the conversation, you rhetorically kind of said, is this a new Cold War? And it's interesting because you're using a lot of Cold War analogies. The national security imperative, you're using a lot of Cold War models, Alliance for Progress. So maybe do two things. Answer your own question. Is this a new Cold War? And then second, to the extent it is or isn't, are there lessons or case studies or models from that earlier phase when so many of these agencies, initiatives, American impulses were rolled out that might be relevant to the kind of competition the U.S. is likely to face in the next 10 years?
So I think, I've dodged this. So I would say Newt Gingrich interviewed me for his podcast and Hugh Hewitt interviewed me for his radio show. And both of them said, I like your book. Both of them said, I have one disagreement. They both said, we think we're in a second Cold War. And you kind of dodge that, or kind of don't use that term in your book. You say it's an age of great power competition. So I would say that I don't think we have a consensus in the U.S. yet that it's a second Cold War. I do think that if we say it's a second Cold War, I think it's got a little bit of finality to it, or a little bit of, it's got, I think I think it may create sort of a frame that may limit us in terms of how we respond to it. I also think the Cold War that we had was very much kind of a military. There was a lot of ideas involved in it, but this is a much more economic and much more of a development challenge as well as a military challenge. So I think great power competition allows us to kind of talk about it in ways. I also hope we can find a way to, have some minimum guardrails. People like Kevin Rudd have talked about that in his book. And I know, Evan, you think about these things on a day-to-day basis. So I think I am leery of using the term only because I think it has a finality to it. And I think I want to bring along as many people as possible to understand that, who may not necessarily agree with me on everything, that we need to have a bipartisan consensus about doing something about this. And I think we're not there yet. I think there's some people in the Democratic Party that are concerned that we're going to demonize China or demonize. And I also think they're concerned about, what does this mean for people who are Asian American? Are we going to kind of like overshoot? So I think that's a legitimate concern. I think it's an issue we need to be really careful about. So I think There's some concern around that. I also think there's a lot of folks in the American business community that are doing lots of business with China. We still have a very healthy economic partnership with China. So if we said we're in a second Cold War, how do we justify having all this economic activity? So I think there's a series of things like that we'd have to sort of think through or sort out. So I think great power competition allows us to kind of talk about this and say that we've got a challenge without necessarily saying we've got a challenge and we're getting a full-on divorce. I keep thinking we're going to go from sort of fifth gear with China. We're trying to go to sort of third gear with China. Like we're still going to be engaged with them, but we're just going to have a kind of a more, I don't think we can go to zero with them. And so I've been trying to think about like I said, like maybe it's, like I said, it's maybe we can sit together at diplomatic high school graduation and watch our kid graduate with our spouses, like it's a different kind of a relationship, but you know what I mean? So I think, so I've eschewed it because I think it allows us to kind of because I also think if you say second Cold War, I think there are some people who kind of want to glom onto that and debate that. And so I've just said, I'm going to dodge that. I'm going to put that to the side. And because I think there's we have a problem. We need to have a consensus about what to do about this.
Yeah, the other problem I think is there's also multiple constituencies that the U.S. is playing to here. I mean, the subtitle of your book talks about global leadership. So, we want to build a national security. We want to build a national consensus around being competitive and exercising global leadership. China may or may not be useful to doing that, but meanwhile, you're also trying to build a consensus with more and more countries around the world to build a coalition that looks to the United States, that looks to U.S. models, that looks to the U.S. as a partner. And the problem I find is that in a lot of countries, as I said before, they don't want to make that choice. And so you run into this problem of balances that what works domestically in the United States in terms of mobilizing coalitions can sometimes have a backlash effect around the world as you're trying to build a global coalition too.
Just a two finger on that, Evan. Just look at the French visit by Macron to China, which was didn't go over very well, where he was basically like, we need to have our own position in Europe vis-a-vis the United States and China. And I think it went over terribly. I found it very awful what he did. But I think there's a speech today, I think is it by the foreign minister of the UK, who's saying today, we're not in a second Cold War. It's not in the UK's interest. So it's a little bit to your point about multiple constituencies. If we want to bring people along, if we say second Cold War, that means they all have to sign on to that too. And I don't think they're ready. I think they're behind us. I think they're getting there. I'm sure you see this too. I see a lot of European countries since COVID, really since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, realized, wait a minute, these guys are not, acting fully above board, and we need to kind of rethink some of our assumptions. Like they're kind of 10 years behind or 5 years behind, I think, where the US is on this.
Yeah. So I want to bring the audience in because we're starting to get some good questions. So one is really about partisanship in the US. And you've been politically active, you've been active in American politics. So this is really a question about where we are as a country and what that means for global leadership. So the question basically says, what's US soft power worth if we're not unified as a country ourselves? How can we lead the world if we can't lead our own country toward a consensus? So I guess to put that pithily, how much of a problem is hyperpartisanship for building consensus on anything, first in the policy realm, but second, what kind of model does it showcase to the world if you're trying to create, if you're trying to leverage soft power and create something that makes the United States seem attractive?
So I do think hyperpartisanship is a problem. I do think, though, that if I think about the Trump administration came in and said, we're going to get rid of OPEC. Then they kind of woke up and smelled the coffee and said, whoa, we need to put OPEC on triple steroids. We need to have the BUILD Act.
It's the Overseas Private Investment.
Yeah. They created the DFC instead. They spent a political capital on it because they're so freaked out because of this I can't fight something with nothing argument. And when we put it to them, are you prepared to cede this space to China? They were like, no, then you need to do this. The same with the Exim Bank. They went and said, we're getting this Exim Bank thing. That's like corporate welfare. That's crap. We're getting rid of that. As you know, Evan, there's 75 export credit agencies in different countries around the world. And so they, after a lot of hemming and hawing, but with some really able political leadership by Kim Reed, who became the chair of the Exim Bank in the Trump administration, she was able to get the right set of Republicans to come along to reauthorize Exim Bank and do a number of fixes to it that were really good. I helped her with that as well. And I would say they went in saying, we're getting rid of the Exim Bank. And they changed their tune after they got in. The same thing in the multilateral system. So I know a lot of your listeners who may not be Republicans would say like, oh, the Trump administration hated the multilateral system, blew up the multilateral system. It's more complicated than that. There's something like 200 multilateral agencies around the world. There are, of which 30 are what might be described as the commanding heights of the international system. We put forward really able people. The guy who ran the World Food Program was great. The woman, Henrietta Fore, who ran for UNICEF, was great. David Malpass has been a great head of the World Bank. The number 2 guy we put in at the IMF, Jeff Okamoto, is one of the great minds of his generation. These are very serious people. We did get our teeth kicked in, and I encourage your listeners to read this article in Foreign Policy from 2019. I think it was one of those interesting articles I've read in the last 5 years on the election of the Food and Agriculture Organization election of 2019. The Chinese had a candidate, the French had a candidate, and the Americans backed a candidate. So the West was divided, starting with that. China's candidate got 120 votes. The American candidate got 12. This was in the Trump administration. So my point to the Trump administration was, this isn't 1995 anymore. We can't say US out of the UN. I'm not going to pay my dues. They're all useless. So we now had a competitor that could put forward really able candidates who had diplomatic clout to kind of run effective elections, and then they beat us. You'll note, and you might put in the chat, there's an article I did in 1945, the blog a week ago, asking, did the U.S. get rolled again at the FAO? And your listeners may or may not find this interesting. There's this article in the Foreign Policy. So my point is, in the multilateral, so I would say is, I understand where the question is coming from, but I would say that, and even in the case of Ukraine, we haven't talked about Ukraine much in this conversation, 80% of the House Republicans and 80% of the Senate Republicans in May of last year voted to support military and economic support for the Ukrainian cause. Now, is it at 80% today? I don't know. I don't think so. But my point is, I think we misunderstand that there are a lot of voices in the Republican Party that don't necessarily are in leadership or necessarily reflect the majority. Now, it's true that some of our potential presidential candidates speak in ways that am not happy about, and I think are not, put it mildly, as not helpful, and frankly is counterproductive and even destructive. But I think, and I worry that some of those voices are going to pull other presidential candidates in an irresponsible way. But I think if a Republican gets into office next, they're going to have the same challenges that the Trump administration had, whether it's in the multilateral system or otherwise. And they're not going to be able to just say, well, I'm going to blow it off. This is, like I said, this is not 1995 anymore. And I think even fear of China is a gateway drug to get Republicans to engage on international issues and to operate in a conservative internationalist way.
So we have another question that kind of, it reflects that, but in international context, that you can use fear of China to mobilize interest in potential alternatives from the United States. But then it begs the question of what exactly are the alternatives? So this is really, the question is about debt, right? China saddling up countries with debt, Sri Lanka is an example. But, what I've observed, I wrote an article a few years ago where I said the U.S. was whining without competing. Does a lot of whining, runs around and says, oh, look, they're going to run you into debt. Don't take their money. Look what they did in this country. Look what they did in that country.
Look what they did in Sri Lanka, right?
Right, yeah, look what they did in Sri Lanka. But then the question is, where are your private sector lenders in this country? They're not lending to us. Or you have all this conditionality. I mean, we talked about the multilateral system. The IMF is not broadly popular in many parts of the global South. They don't like the conditionality. It's seen as a tool of Western power. It's seen as imposing conditions that are not well suited to, in the first instance, the political conditions in the country, but second, having a particular frame on macroeconomic stability. So the question is about the question basically asks you to speak to how the U.S. could respond to China's, loading countries up with debt. But let's broaden that question. In cases like that, how can the U.S. engage differently with wherever, Sri Lanka, Zambia, you pick
Sure.
country,
Right. So
rather than just saying, don't take China's money, and oh, by the way, go to the IMF and take
right. So I think
way?
there's several issues. This is a really important question. I would say that So great power competition has come to high finance. It's come to all these other things we talk about. It's also come to high finance. So 30 years ago, we'd have put Paul Volcker in the room with 30, money center bank CEOs, the CEO of Citibank and the CEO of Barclays. They'd have smoked cigars and they said, gentlemen, because it was all gentlemen, we're gonna work out this emerging markets debt stuff, right? That was in essence how it used to work. Today, the debt held in developing countries is held by China, much of it, and a lot of it's held by hedge funds. So it's really hard to coordinate all these people. The other problem in the case of China is you don't really know, what the agreements were, what the tenor, like the length of the loans and what the collateral was and what the interest rate was. It's all not transparent because they do not ascribe. There's a multilateral institution called the Paris Club, which is a club of debtors. They are not a member of the Paris Club. So they don't describe to kind of the Marquis of Queensberry rules of high finance. And so we have a big problem with mainland China on this. There have been attempts to deal with that. So that's one problem. The other problem is 20 years ago, at the height of our global power, we did something called HIPC, which was the debt forgiveness of poor countries in Africa. It was a really good thing. The Catholic Church was involved. The Republican Party that controlled the Congress was involved. The Clinton administration and the beginning of the Bush administration it was done at the height of kind of America's power. We're now coming to a point less than 25 years later, within living memory, of having a do-over of a much more complicated, much more decentralized, much more difficult to work out debt crisis that's going to be with us for at least a decade. It's going to impact growth rates in these countries. It's going to impact a whole series of other difficult trade-offs and may produce political instability in these countries. So I think we have that problem. The other thing, though, is I go back to you can't fight something with nothing. If we go around, this is what the Trump administration would do during COVID, don't take their ventilators. If we didn't have an alternative, that wasn't a thing. Or don't take their money for that electric dam. Well, guess what? If the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank is not going to help enable building a hydroelectric dam, because hydroelectric dams are bad for the snail darter, or guess what? There are a number of institutions now that won't finance gas projects because gas is climate change. Gas equals climate change, and that's bad. There's some financial institutions in the West that won't finance airports because Greta doesn't like airports, Evan. I mean, that's crazy. So who do you think is going to build those airports, right? I mean, China's going to build those airports. So I think we need to understand that we don't have to meet China dollar for dollar in the infrastructure game. And if China wants to build a farm to market road in Zambia, that's fine. If they build a dual use port, that's a problem. If they build a dual use airport, that's a problem. If they're going to control the digital rails of Zambia in the future, my message has been for several years, we need to find ways to enable an alternative. Sometimes that's the private sector. Sometimes that's the multilateral development banks. Sometimes it's the alphabet super, what are called development finance institutions and export agencies. We also probably, going back to what USAID ought to be doing, they've never been that great. They got out of the infrastructure business other than, say, Afghanistan. We may need to have some kind of special series of specialized functions around infrastructure that we get back into as part of being a global power. And AID would be potentially a place for that to live.
Okay. So we're pretty much at time, but I thought for a last question, you mentioned that we hadn't talked about Ukraine much. And I mean, the reality is that's going to be an interesting test at some point. At some point, the war will end, hopefully. In any case, Ukraine, one way or the other, is going to have a massive reconstruction bill. I mean, it's going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And presumably they will look everywhere. They may even look to China for project finance, notwithstanding the fact that Mr. Xi has not yet called Mr. Zelensky, despite some suggestions from his government that he might do so, despite the fact that the Chinese, as I've written, appear to be in the tank for Moscow. But the reality is, if you look around the world, there are not, as I said earlier, that many places that are lenders, builders, traders, investors, all of the above. So let's just say hypothetically, hopefully Ukraine wins the war. We get to a point down the road in any case where some kind of peace comes and reconstruction becomes the order of the day. This tab is going to run into the hundreds of billions. So how should the United States, but then also Europe in the second instance, be thinking about that as a challenge? Just kind of run that before we wrap up as a test case of everything you've argued on soft
Yeah.
power. If you think about how the U.S. is, it's not about military aid anymore. We're talking about reconstruction.
Yeah.
Go through the toolkit
Yep.
and go through the partnerships and talk a little bit about how the U.S. would.
So we've been writing a year-long commission on Ukraine reconstruction. So I really appreciate asking this question because I'm pretty good at a virtual seminar in Carnegie on this topic. So thanks for asking this question. So I'd say, so we have we've done a year-long commission on Ukraine economic reconstruction. I encourage people to go visit our website at CSIS about that. So we've done about 200 interviews on this, and I would say we've done about 25 virtual roundtables on different dimensions of Ukraine's reconstruction, and we in the last year. And so I would say my deepest thought is we need to align all of Ukraine's reconstruction with accession to the European Union. That is like, that is going to be the biggest gravitational pull to kind of change the political economics, the political economy of Ukraine. There's not enough foreign aid to rebuild Ukraine. There's some discussion about going after the frozen central bank assets of the Russian Federation. I think that's something we ought to look at. I think it's going to take a darn long time before we see any of that money. The Ukrainian government has to make a series of major economic reforms if they want to join the European Union club. And I think that will also make Ukraine attractive as a place for foreign direct investment. We're going to need to have a lot of private sector to invest in the reconstruction of Ukraine. What I think is also completely unacceptable is we need to have a naughty list and a nice list for the Ukraine reconstruction. If you voted the wrong way, like mainland China did on all those UN votes, like we ought to have a little naughty list like Santa Claus saying you were naughty, you're like not getting anything in the reconstruction. I think Ukraine needs to have a list to know who their friends are. And I think it's becoming very, very clear that mainland China is not their friend. But frankly, there have been a number of other countries who have been very disappointing, who we've, would hope would act in a different way, that have not been helpful on the Ukrainian cause in the multilateral system. So I also think they'd have to also, I think, be, not participate in any kind of reconstruction. So I think there's not enough foreign aid. Think about central bank assets. Think about reforms linked to access to the European Union. And then we use foreign aid as that's the pull, and the foreign aid and other kind of soft money is the push to move Ukraine in a number of different ways, whether it's in sort of the governance space or kind of economic reform space. I also, I think they, clearly the vast majority of Ukrainians now they're in the process of getting a violent, angry divorce after a 400-year-old shotgun wedding to Russia. That's what's going on in the war. They're changing their religion. They're changing when they celebrate Christmas. They're changing what language they speak. They're changing what their infrastructure looks like. They're changing where they get their energy from. They're changing who they trade with. They're changing literally almost everything in their society is going through a massive change as a result of this war. Vladimir Putin, ironically, is the father of modern Ukrainian nationalism in some ways, you could argue.
All right. Well, a provocative note on which to end. Dan, I'm really glad you did this, and I'm glad we got a chance to showcase some of the arguments in the book. Available in fine bookstores everywhere, including around Washington, D.C. But elsewhere. In any case, the book's called The American Imperative, and it really is about the case for using soft power as a tool for American leadership around the world. So I encourage people to read it, buy it. And Dan, really appreciate you doing this. And thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Evan. This was great. Thank you, Carnegie.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.